May 5th, 1945, Mauthausen. The gate was open, but nobody inside moved like freedom had arrived. An American medic named Daniel Harper stepped through the wire with a canteen on his belt and a medical bag in his hand. He had seen men blown apart in France. He had seen frozen bodies in the Ardennes. He thought there was nothing left in Europe that could surprise him. Then the smell reached him. Stone dust, sickness, burned coal, human waste, and something beneath all of it that the brain refused to name. He looked toward the barracks. Men were standing there in striped rags, so thin they seemed held together by the air itself. Some smiled without strength. Some cried without sound. Some simply stared at the Americans as if liberation was another trick the camp had invented. And beside the medic, a captain whispered one sentence he would repeat for the rest of his life. God help us, they're still alive. This is not a story about the liberation of a camp. It is about a canteen. It is about a prisoner who weighed 92 pounds. It is about a captured SS man kneeling in the dirt, begging for one mouthful of water. And it is about the question no army manual had prepared anyone to ask. Do you give water to the man who spent years teaching you thirst? Marek Adler had been a clock repairman in D before the war. Not famous, not political, not important to anyone outside one narrow street where people brought him pocket watches, broken alarm clocks, and wedding gifts that had stopped ticking. He knew gears, springs, patience, the small discipline of making a dead thing move again. Then the Germans came and the street changed names and the clocks disappeared, and Marek learned that time could be stolen as easily as bread. By the spring of 1945 he had survived the ghetto, transport, forced labor, and Mauthausen's stone quarry. 3 years had taken the flesh from his face. His hands, once steady enough to set a balance wheel, shook when he lifted a spoon. But his memory had not starved. That was the part the guards never understood. Hunger could blur a face. Fever could break a voice. Beatings could make one day dissolve into the next. But cruelty had habits. A guard's whistle at dawn. A boot step on gravel. A laugh before the blow landed. The way one man poured water onto the ground and waited to see who would crawl toward the mud. Marek remembered those things with the precision of a watchmaker. So when the Americans began sorting prisoners from guards, and one man in a filthy striped coat kept his head too low, Marek saw him. Not guessed. Saw Otto Kessler, SS Unterscharfherr, barracks detail, water ration supervisor, a man who had once stood beside a barrel on a summer afternoon, tipped a ladle into the dirt, and said in German that thirst made prisoners obedient. Marek lifted one finger. That was all. A finger from a man too weak to shout. The prisoners near him understood before the Americans did. A sound moved through them, not quite a word, not quite a growl. The kind of sound a room makes when the truth enters before anyone is ready. Kessler tried to run. He made it 6 steps. A soldier put him face. Down in the dirt. Another tore open the striped under it, stitched inside the waistband where he thought no one would look, was part of his old uniform lining. The captain in charge was named Thomas Hale. He was 36 years old, from Iowa, and until that morning he had believed discipline meant keeping angry men from doing angry things. By noon he understood discipline meant something harder. It meant standing between survivors and the men who had destroyed them. It meant protecting a prisoner who deserved no pity, because a dead guard could not answer questions, sign statements, identify officers, or stand in front of a judge. It meant forcing justice to remain justice, even when revenge would have felt clean. Hale ordered Kessler bound and set in the shade near the dispensary, but there was no shade left by the time the questioning began. The camp was chaos. Medics were cutting lice, ridden clothing from living skeletons. Soldiers were carrying soup in buckets. Translators were trying to turn dozens of languages into emergency orders. No one noticed when Kessler was left in the open. 2 hours passed. Then 3. The May sun in Austria was sharp enough to make the quarry stones shine white. Kessler's lips cracked, his face reddened. The same man who had controlled water now had none, and when Captain Hale came back across the yard, Kessler raised his head. He did not look at the prisoners. He looked at the canteen on the medic's belt. Water. No one moved. Kessler swallowed against a throat too dry to swallow. Please, water. The medic's hand went to the canteen by instinct, then stopped. Around him, American soldiers stared at the captain. Around the captain, prisoners stared at Kessler, and behind them all stood Marek Adler, 92 pounds, wrapped in a U.S. blanket, watching the man who had once made thirst into a weapon. Captain Hale had every regulation in his head. Enemy prisoner, secure custody, preserve life. Gather testimony, prepare transfer. The regulation was simple. The moment was not, because in that yard, rules written on paper felt almost insulting. They had not been written by the men who had stood in the roll call square at dawn. They had not been written by men who had watched friends lick moisture from boards. They had not been written by men who knew exactly what Otto Kessler had done with a ladle and a smile. Hale turned toward the prisoners. Then his eyes found Marek, maybe because Marek was the one who had pointed. Maybe because Marek was the only one looking at Kessler without shouting. Maybe because the captain, in a moment he never later defended, needed one human being from inside the camp to tell him what kind of world they were standing in. Hale asked quietly, "What should I do?" The interpreter repeated it in Polish. Marek did not answer. He looked at Kessler. He saw the cracked lips, the bound hands, the dirt on the striped coat Kessler had stolen from a dead or dying man, and then memory opened with the violence of a door kicked in. He saw the water barrel. He saw men lined under the sun. He saw Kessler dip the ladle, raise it to a prisoner's mouth, then pull it away just as the man leaned forward. He heard the laugh. He saw the ladle empty into dust. He remembered thinking, not in words exactly, but in the deep place below words, that the Germans were not only trying to kill bodies, they were trying to train the soul to resemble them before the body died. That was the real work of the camp. Not only hunger, not only labor, not only fear. The camp wanted witnesses of cruelty to be. It wanted the victim to dream of becoming the guard. It wanted the last surviving part of a person to be shaped like the hand that struck him. Marek understood that better than any officer in that yard, so he took his time. A full minute passed. No one interrupted him. Even Kessler stopped begging. Finally, Marek asked the interpreter one question. "Will he be tried?" The interpreter looked at Captain Hale. Hale answered immediately. "Yes." Marek kept his eyes on Kessler. "Will he be guarded?" "Yes." Will he be made to speak? Hale's jaw tightened. If we can make him speak, yes. Marek nodded once, then he said, "Give him water." The interpreter hesitated, as if the words had arrived in the wrong order. Marek repeated them. "Give him water." The medic looked at the captain. The captain looked at Marek. Kessler looked at the canteen as if it were the first honest thing he had ever seen. Hale stepped closer to Marek. "You understand what he is?" Marek's expression did not change. "I know what he is. You understand what he did. I know better than you." That ended the question. Daniel Harper unscrewed the canteen. He crossed the yard and held it near Kessler's mouth. Kessler lunged for it so hard the medic jerked back. Slow, Kessler drank. Water ran down his chin. He coughed. He drank again. The yard watched him do the smallest human thing in the world and made it feel like a verdict. After 3 swallows, Hale took the canteen away. Kessler tried to follow it with his mouth. "That's enough," Hale said. Then Hale turned back to Marek. The captain's voice was lower now. "Why?" Marek looked tired suddenly. Not weak, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the body. He answered in Polish, and the interpreter's voice nearly broke translating it. "Because if he dies like an animal in front of us, then the camp gets one more victory." No one spoke. The line moved through the Americans differently than it moved through the survivors. The Americans heard mercy. The survivors heard strategy. Marek had not forgiven Otto Kessler. He had not absolved him. He had not pretended thirst had made them equal. 3 hours in the sun was not 3 years in Mauthausen. A cracked lip was not a quarry. A guarded prisoner was not a starving man under a rifle. Marek knew the difference. That was why he gave the answer he gave. The water was not a gift. It was a boundary. It said, "This is where his world ends, and ours begins again." Kessler was moved that night to a holding area outside the camp. Over the next days, with terrible patience, his name, his post, his duties, the barrel, the quarry detail, the beatings, the men who vanished after refusing work they were too sick to perform. The Americans learned something in those interviews that they had not understood on the first day. A camp was not only a place of murder, it was an archive of witnesses. Every survivor was carrying records no fire could burn. Kessler had tried to hide in the clothing of prisoners because he thought the uniform made him guilty. He was wrong. The people made him guilty. Their memory was stronger than his disguise, and Marek's decision kept that memory useful. A dead man in the dirt would have satisfied one afternoon. A living prisoner could confirm names, chains of command, burial sites, storage rooms, transport logs, and the smaller crimes that proved the larger system. That did not make mercy easy. It made it disciplined. In the weeks after liberation, Marek did not talk about the water unless someone forced the story into the room. He talked about soup. He talked about shoes. He asked whether the Americans could find paper thin enough for tiny gears, because a broken field watch had been placed in his lap by a soldier who did not realize the man under the blanket had once repaired time for a living. Marek fixed it with wire, a needle, and a hand that shook until the work began. The soldier tried to pay him with cigarettes. Marek asked instead for a pencil. He wrote his name on a scrap of medical paper. Marek Adler. For the first time in 3 years he wrote it without a number beside it. That was liberation too. Not flags, not speeches. A man writing his name and seeing it belong to him. Kessler was later transferred into the machinery of occupation justice. His case was one among thousands. The world was exhausted. Courts were crowded. Records were incomplete. Some guilty men vanished. Some were punished. Some lied well enough to live ordinary lives under new names. The end of war did not make justice perfect. It only made justice possible. Marek knew that. He did not build his life around Kessler's punishment. He built it around leaving the camp. He spent months in a displaced persons camp learning English from shipping labels and army newspapers. He sailed to New York in 1948 with 2 shirts, 1 photograph, and a watch movement wrapped in cloth. In Chicago he found work in the back of a jewelry repair shop, where nobody asked why he flinched when a door slammed. He married a woman named Lydia who had survived by pretending to be older than she was. They had a daughter, then a son, then grandchildren who learned that their grandfather could repair anything with springs, but could not sit with his back to a door. For 47 years, Marek fixed clocks, kitchen clocks, mantel clocks, cheap alarm clocks students brought in with embarrassed faces, gold watches widows carried in velvet boxes. He restored small measures of time for other people, and never said that time had once been the thing taken from him most completely. Only once, near the end of his life, did his granddaughter ask him directly about the Guard. She was 17. She had been reading about the war for a school paper. She knew the simple version of the story, the prisoner, the canteen, the water. She asked what everyone asks when the story is told too quickly. Did you forgive him? Marek sat at his kitchen table in Chicago, turning a watch screw between 2 fingers. He did not answer for a long time. Then the girl looked confused. But you gave him water. Marek nodded. Yes. So wasn't that forgiveness? No, forgiveness is when the debt leaves your house. I did not let that debt leave. I only refused to let it choose my furniture. She did not understand until years later. Most people do not. They think the opposite of revenge is forgiveness. Sometimes it is, but sometimes the opposite of revenge is control. Sometimes it is refusing to let the worst person you ever met decide the shape of your hand. Sometimes it is keeping an enemy alive. Not because he deserves life, but because the truth deserves a witness and the future deserves a trial. That was what Marek understood in the yard at Mauthausen. He was not saving Kessler from thirst. He was saving the line between justice and cruelty, a line so thin that day it could have fit inside the rim of a canteen. Years later, after Marek died, his family found a folded note inside a tin box full of watch parts. It was not dramatic. It was not written for history. It was written in his careful English, the kind of English built by a man who learned a new language 1 useful word at a time. The notes, nothing could do that. The water kept me from carrying his work out of the camp for him. That is the part people miss. The Nazis lost the war before Marek gave the water. Their armies were broken. Their flags were coming down. Their leaders were dead, captured, or hiding. But a system like that does not only try to win territory. It tries to survive inside the people it wounds. It tries to leave behind reflexes. Hate quickly. Humiliate first. Make suffering useful. Call cruelty order, call revenge justice. The camp had spent 3 years teaching Marek those lessons. And in the dirt of liberation, with the man who had taught them kneeling in front of him, Marek refused the final exam. He gave water, not because Kessler was human enough to deserve it, because Marek was human enough to choose it. There was no parade for that. No medal, no inscription carved into stone, just a canteen opened under a hard May sun, just a medic watching his own hands shake, just a captain learning that discipline could look like mercy and still not be mercy, just a survivor weighing 92 pounds, guarding the border of his own soul with a sentence no camp could take from him. He did not give water to his enemy. He gave it to the man he still intended to be when he walked out through the gate.